So here I have a Felix jacket made from a silk noil. Silk noil has a very loose open weave. You can see I'll put that close, which means that it's perfect for creating a Chanel style trim. But what it also means is that because it frays so much, I needed to stabilise the edge. So I have overlocked around all the outer edges just to stop it from fraying and to stabilise it for when I sew the fringing on. I could have bound the edges as well, but because this frays so much, the overlocking actually makes the edge stronger, whereas if I had sewn a binding around the edge, it could actually sort of pull away. So in this instance, overlocking is the best finish. I'm going to make a little sample of how to do the fringing for the Chanel style trim. I have a couple of pieces of bias binding that are cut here that need to be joined. The silk noil has a very distinct warp and weft, so when I'm joining them I need to ensure that the warp and weft are going in the same directions. To join the bias binding, I'm going to do it on the straight grain, which looks like a diagonal, but rather than joining it by butting it up, I need to actually turn it over and line up the cut edge with an overlap at each side so that the actual stitching line finishes on the cut edge of the bias binding. Normally I would sew from edge to edge, but because I'm going to be fringing this bias binding, I'm actually just going to sew about 2 centimeters in the middle so that when I come to fray that fringing, it's not going to be actually sewn. I'm going to use a smallish stitch and making sure I back tack at each end, just sewing that short little distance. Like so. Take that out of the machine, trim the threads, and then I'm just actually going to trim that seamlet. So I'm going to trim off those edges, take that back to about 1/2 centimetre and trim that edge. So you can see if I open this out, it's actually open on the top and the bottom. So I'm going to do that to both sides and give it a press. I have pressed the seam allowances open on my bias binding strips, and now I'm going to join them together. So I'm going to place them so that I've got both sides facing up on top of each other. And if you do have 2 joins, you might even like to just offset those joins so that they're not directly on top of each other. Next, I'm going to mark the center of my bias binding. So you can use a ruler, or I'm just going to freehand that straight down the middle. And I'm going to sew a row of stitching about 1/2 centimetre on each side of that line that I've drawn. I'm just pulling the bias binding slightly as I go, so that any stretch is incorporated into that sewing. Okay, and back down the other side. Make sure when you come to sewing over those joins that you keep it nice and flat underneath. So I've used a coordinating thread, so it is matching beautifully, and that is ideal. Next, you're going to take an unpicker or an awl. My special unpicker actually has an awl at the other end, and I find that this is quite useful. Next, you're just going to flick along that bias edge, teasing out the fibres. And with a really open weave like this, it's super easy to do. I'm just going through both layers, flicking along like so, and you can see it's fringing beautifully. To do the other side, just turn it over and do the same thing. So work out how much bias you need, do these steps, and then just fringe the bias binding. You can make this narrower if you want as well, or you can keep it wider and then just trim off those edges if you want it to look a bit narrower. And that's how you make the Chanel trim. So here I've made all my fringing and I've given that a little press, and I'm ready to sew that onto my jacket, making sure that the joins are underneath. So I'm actually going to start sewing this from the left side seam, and I'm just going to have a slight overhang of the fringing. I'm going to sew the first pass on the wrong side because I want to make sure that the distance from the overlocked edge is even. So I'm going to turn that over. And I'm going to start sewing about 2 centimeters from the edge of the side seam. And I'm going to just sew all the way around the jacket. When you come to the curves, just sort of manipulate the binding around that edge so that it fits nicely into the curve. Now I've come almost to my starting point, and I'm just going to stop sewing about 5 centimeters or 2 inches from that starting point and take that out. So you can see I've got this sort of little gap there. Now I'm going to turn that over to the right side. And I can look at how I want to finish this off. Because it's on the bias, I'm actually going to cut the trim on the bias and not straight so that it looks continuous. So I'll do the bit underneath first. Just trim that off. And lay the top part over so there's an overlap of about 1 centimeter. And cut that on the diagonal as well. And then I'm just going to sew that gap closed. Trim the threads. And you can see that's almost invisible. Now I'm going to sew a second pass of sewing on the other row of stitching that I've got on my trim, just to make sure that that is nice and secure. And back to my starting point. Take it out of the machine. And I'm going to give that a press. I've sewn the fringing and given it a press, and how good does that look? I've also sewn the cuffs as well. Now, this looks great as it is, but we can make this even a bit more fancy. So with Chanel trims, they sometimes have a really nice chain detail going through the middle. To do that, you need some chain. So I just got this from the hardware shop. The one that I'm using is called a clock chain, 1.8 millimeters by 2.5 meters. We'll see if that's enough. I might actually need to do 2 pieces. So the way you do it is you thread fabric, weaving it in and out of the chain. Ideally, you would do this using bias strips, but I've got this little bit of chiffon here. It's a silk, which is a perfect match, but there's really not very much of it, so I'm actually going to do this on the straight grain. The only thing with doing it on the straight grain is that the edges fray, and if you've got bias strips, they're not going to fray in the same way. So I'm just going to cut myself some sections. I'm going to make them 4 centimeters wide because as it goes through the chain it becomes a little bit sort of narrow as it stretches, particularly if you do it on the bias. So I'm just going to snip those and just tear them along the length of the fabric. Snip the end. I think 3 lengths should about do it. And one more. Like so, and pop them to one side. Now I'm going to take one of these lengths, and to thread it through the chain, what I like to do is use a darning needle because it's got a nice fat head on it. So I'm just going to pleat the fabric so that I can thread the needle. See if I can do this. There we go. And just having a little tail. And I'm just going to take my chain and thread it through the first section, coming almost the whole way. Then I'm just going to go back through the chain, and as you can see, because I've got this on the straight grain, how that's fraying, so you just sort of need to give that a little pull. Getting started is always a bit tricky. There we go. Once you've got the first one through though, it is actually easier. So then I'm going to thread back through, so I'm always sort of keeping it fairly straight, and I'm just wrapping the fabric effectively around, so I just let the chain twist. So I've always got the top chain is straight so that I can just go through like that, and then just sort of let the chain twist as it goes, and back through. So just keep doing that the whole way along, and actually you can get pretty fast at it. It doesn't take too long. Little trick is if you pull the bottom edge down and pinch that between your finger and thumb and then thread through, it actually is much easier, and the fabric won't get caught in the same way as with the sort of straight grain. You're not getting all that sort of fraying edges getting in the way like that. And you can see you can actually get quite quick at this, and keep working your way along. So I've finished threading my chain with the fabric, and look how pretty that chain looks on top of the fringing. So to sew that on, you need to sew it by hand. So I've just taken, I'm starting again from that left side seam, and I'm just going to over sew a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to sew through the chain loop, and then I'm just going to work my way along, coming up through every second chain loop, because every second one is the flat, whereas those ones are standing up, so I want to keep it nice and flat. And this is probably the most time consuming part, but really if you're going to go to the effort of doing a trim like this, why not? It's nice to do a bit of slow sewing sometimes. So coming up, and I'm going to do all the way around on one side and then come back to the other. So you don't need to watch me doing all of that, but I'll show you how I join it when I have finished sewing it. So I'm nearly at the point where I need to join my chain together on top of my fringing. So I've separated the excess chain, and I've opened up the link, and I'm just going to join the links together, and then I just find it easier to use some pliers. This is quite strong chain because I got it from the hardware shop, and just close the link. It doesn't need to be a perfect join because we're going to have the fabric going through it as well, so whatever you can work with. And there I've joined my link. Now what I need to do is just carry on threading through my fabric. I don't want to get twisted. And I'm just going to overlap the two ends just to join the fabric. So that it looks seamless. Coming up to that point, so I'm just going to trim that one off and over thread with this one. Going through and then through, and then just back through one, like that. Trim off the ends, and then I'm just going to carry on sewing to fill in that space. So here it is, my finished Felix jacket hot off the sewing machine. I've made this in silk noil. It's got the square pocket without cuffs and is unlined, and I finished it off with my fancy trim, which is this frayed bias edge with the chain threaded through with fabric, and I've got that on the cuffs as well. The chain really gives a lovely weight to the edges of this jacket. This jacket is such a versatile pattern. Depending on the fabrics you use or the finishes that you do, you can achieve so many different looks. So I can't wait to see yours. Tag me at Pattern Union because I love to see what you're sewing to.